CSIRO has published a book called Biodiversity, Science and Solutions for Australia. Here to provide some further insights into biodiversity in Australia are the book's editors, Dr. Andy Shepherd, Dr. Steve Morton and Dr. Mark Lonsdale. So why is biodiversity so important?
It's our life support system. It's what provides the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink ultimately. So without that, we're living on a dead planet.
Well, we wouldn't be living on a dead planet.
True, right.
So while biodiversity, as Mark rightly says, is our life support system, there are still big questions out there about how much biodiversity do we need. You know, if you look at the European landscape, most of it's been modified by man. Very little is pristine and untouched. Australia is almost the opposite. You know, there's still huge questions to say, well, how much biodiversity do we actually need in order to be able to have a life-sustaining planet? We know that the more biodiversity there is, the more primary production you have on that piece of land, the more that land, that community and that land can be resilient to change, and the more ecosystem services that land can provide. But as human development and disturbance is something we can't escape from, it is still a huge question to know, you know, how much is enough and how much can we let go of and not put our life support system at risk.
And it's not, yes, and then there's more, again, because it's not just the life support system, there's also several other values that many members of society place upon the natural world. People who obtain spiritual reward from it. People who believe it to be incredibly important for their recreational benefit. So the ecological life support one is probably primary alongside the economic value that we obtain directly through harvesting native species. But you cannot discount completely those other aspects of value that people read into the natural environment around them. So balancing all those things, that's a challenging task, and a really interesting one.
It's a life support system, but we don't want to just survive, do we? We want to live. We want to experience. We want to experience a country that's vibrant and healthy. And you know, in preparing the book, someone said to me, you know, I think this is an extreme view, but I warm to it. Every species that we lose diminishes us as Australians. You know, they're Australians too.
And where do you think the future of biodiversity science is heading in Australia? What are some of the new technologies that you think will really change the landscape for us in biodiversity science?
I think one of the things that we've really lacked is the capacity to know what's going on out there in enough time to be able to make useful decisions. So what we're starting to see now is the capturing of data from observers on the ground. Community groups, catchment groups, and so on are able to feed their data into things like the Atlas of Living Australia, through things like ecogenomics, you know, which is basically a system of using modern techniques for detecting the presence of genes of particular types, of particular species, particular organisms, and being able to say this system is heading in this direction, that system is heading in that direction, based on very rapid detection of the presence and absence of particular species, particular metabolic cycles, so that you can say the ecosystem's functioning well or badly. Those kind of things are becoming very readily and cheaply available now. Some of the areas that we're working on as well are about being able to, we hear about the use of military drones. Those have revolutionised counter-terrorism. We're finding that kind of technology can be applied in mapping and monitoring biodiversity at quite large scales in a way that previously we've had to do through, trudging through the bush and.
Yeah, Mark's absolutely right. I mean, to be able to automate the collection of biodiversity data through drones, but also through sensor networks, which can pick up species, but can also pick up all the environmental information, allows you to be able to measure change in real time at extremely low cost.
Yeah, wow.
Biodiversity classic biodiversity research with people on the ground is very expensive, as is the restoration activities. So the more we can automate the way we collect our data through remote sensing, through sensor networks, through automated remote, unmanned vehicles and so on, and all that technology is now just starting to come along. We're only scratching the surface of knowing what it can do. Then that will put us in a much stronger place to be able to know what's happening and be able to respond to change.
Right. So there's one thing, though, that hasn't been mentioned yet that is really important for the future of biodiversity science, and that is to connect the physical understanding, the understanding of what's happening in the natural world, to human values and human needs. So connecting that change that might be being undergone out there in the natural environment as it influences us in our social and economic systems. And biodiversity science will begin reaching out more and more in future years to these other disciplines to try to understand how we could end up weighing these pluses and minuses as humans decide to use this part of the environment for this purpose, at this influence on biodiversity, and then how you judge that and trade it off against some other benefit somewhere else. That'll be a huge part of the future development of the science.
Science also informs policy too. So in other words, when you have a broader understanding in the community and the government knows which ways it wants to go, science can also inform, what are the instruments or mechanisms that we can develop to try and encourage more participation and encourage that the investments into this space just don't come out of the public purse. One of our major projects that we've been involved in recently is trying to understand the population dynamics of fruit bats, flying foxes, around Australia. And we've been trialling small radio receptors on the backs of foxes that allow not only to understand where the foxes are moving, but who they're interacting with, how much time they're spending in a what's it called, a bat roost versus how much time they're spending on the wing, and it can the receptor can download the information in real time through the network the moment it comes in contact with the network. So all the information is coming in without anybody actually having to be out there with the binoculars doing the counting.
So in the future we might have a problem of too much information rather than...
I think too much information is one of the big challenges, yes. Yeah.
So we talk about big data, and I think you're right. One of the future trends will be the emergence of people able to absorb, synthesize and draw conclusions from vast bodies of data downloaded from these kind of sensor networks, as well as from what I'm hoping and expecting to see a citizenry that is turned on to science and is uploading data all the time.
Yeah. So is that kind of an example from the Atlas of Living Australia app? I've seen the app that people have on their phones and so they can actually contribute data to, is that people are hoping will happen?
Very much so. So don't be worried about sending us too much data. You can send us the data and then we'll work out how to use it.
But let's bear in mind that the Atlas Living Australia app provides data back to the user. So it's not just for scientists. Yeah. The individuals themselves can access all the data, they can access all the tools, the scientists can, and if they're interested and motivated, they can carry out their own analyses around their own communities without having to wait for us boring old scientists to do it.
Well, you may actually indeed the idea of citizen science is that there isn't a divide between a professional scientist and the citizenry. People are actually becoming scientists in their own right.
Well, and of all the fields of science where that ought to be the case, it's in biodiversity science, because we've emphasised over and over again that it's human perception which is going to drive our future, because it's human perception which will cause us to weigh certain things in favour of certain types of resource use and against others. So citizen science in biodiversity, it's both a godsend and a natural, isn't it? Yeah.
I think Mark mentioned genomics. I'll just give one other example of how it can be applied in a very effective way. So if there's any major development activity, be it a mine or a new suburb on a city, you need to know before you start what's already out there. What's out there in that particular patch of land that may be of value, that needs to be protected, that may be unique. And up to now, it's been ecologists going around with clipboards based on, in many cases, fairly poorly documented lists of what occurs in those communities and trying to come up with more complete lists. Expensive, primitive, doesn't really generate complete lists.
Well, hang on, that's what I used to do.
Well, exactly. If you were a scientist now doing biodiversity, Steve, there would be many more tools available to you. And the advantage of...
You are expensive.
And the beauty of genomics is that you can rapidly sequence genomes from any specimen you might go out and collect very, very quickly, and understands what's out there. It does generate a lot of data, but there are tools now to analyze them. So, for example, you can collect insect in traps. You can pick up samples that are coming in the wind. You can pick up dung from animals. You can process this really quickly and very quickly get a much broader understanding in depth, right down to microorganisms, as to what's out in those communities before you start any action. So you have a good baseline data on whether to assess the damage that might happen and where in a particular landscape you can minimize damage, but also to evaluate as you go through how your activities might be changing that landscape. And this is one of the reasons why in the book we were so positive, because these new technologies will change the face of biodiversity science and what we're capable of doing, and the way in which we can monitor change over time.
Fantastic. And what are some of the other kind of key challenges or outcomes that you think biodiversity science needs to address in order to ensure that we have, strong biodiversity into the future?
Yeah, so can I have a first go at this one? For me, the answer to that question is monitoring. Now, we've just been talking a lot about new technologies for monitoring, but the fact of the matter is that most monitoring doesn't work because it's not conducted regularly, systematically, methodically through time. Monitoring is only of use if we continue to do it year after year. And it's only of use if the results of the monitoring are easily and concisely expressed in such a way that anyone can see what's going on. If it's too complex, then people get a bit tired of it and their attention drifts on to something else and the monitoring stops. Monitoring's got to be workable and consistent and indefinite. And that for me is the really biggest challenge of all, because at the moment we don't have any regular methodical such system for biodiversity monitoring in Australia. Partly it's a result of this of scientists not coming through with concise, measurable, understandable parameters. Partly it's immaturity of our perceptions as a society about how important this is going to be in the future.
I mean, there are big programs that have started up in Australia, like the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, with that in mind. So we're starting to see a change. But Steve's absolutely right. It's the lack of good monitoring data which is an extreme handicap when it comes to deciding what you need to do.
And why is all that so important? It is because biodiversity is not stable out there, independent of human activities. It's constantly fluctuating according to climate and disturbance and long-standing changes running across the landscape. It's fluctuating. So the monitoring is so vitally important because the task is to separate natural dips and curves from human-induced changes. Monitoring in any social, economic and natural system is vital. And I applaud the developments that have taken place, Andy. They're so important, but we're not there yet, and that for me is the big gap.
We've heard a bit about what's happening in Australian biodiversity science and things CSIRO is doing, but what about on the international level?
Internationally, biodiversity really seems to be moving up the political agenda. So last year, a whole bunch of governments, I think about 100 governments, got together to form a new platform to bring science and biodiversity policy together, a science policy platform as it's called, a bit like the IPCC that's done so much over the last 20 years to understand and characterise and quantify what's going on with our climate and package that in a way that policymakers can respond. So we've created something similar around biodiversity and ecosystem services, and so that's going to, over the next few years, attempt, as we were saying earlier, to synthesise trends, how things are going, and then project forward and say, if we do this, what will happen? If we do that, what will happen? and provide some guidance to decision makers to, we hope, produce better outcomes for the world. I think, tell the truth, I think Australia's well ahead of that game. It doesn't need this platform as much as some countries do, but a lot of the world's biodiversity is in countries that just don't have Australia's planning and resourcing capacities, and this platform will help them to make better decisions for the future.
And Mark, the platform has a strong social and Indigenous element to it too, so it's not just Western science.
That's absolutely right, Andy. So it's attempting to bridge that gulf that currently exists, that we've tried to tackle in our book, to bring Indigenous knowledge to bear and integrate it with classic Western science and what that's telling us. And when I say classic Western science, too, it's, as Andy says, it's not just about the natural scientists, but it's also saying what are the social sciences. What have they got to tell us about the decisions that we make, and how do we understand and value different aspects of biodiversity? So it's quite an exciting agenda, very ambitious agenda, and Australia's committed to it. Be interesting to see in 20 years' time how much progress we've made. I hope we've set some significant policy agendas for the world through this process.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I've certainly learned a lot. And if you'd like to learn more about biodiversity science in Australia, I'd encourage you to download your free copy of the biodiversity book from www.csiro.au.